There were
How many ways do they execute?
5 or 6 ways: by gas, by shooting, by beating, that is, beating with clubs, by exposure, that is, standing out in the snow naked for 48 hours and having cold water thrown on them in the middle of winter, starvation, dogs, and pushing over a 100-foot cliff.
Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. It's almost impossible to comprehend the amount of atrocities committed against civilians during the Second World War. The scale of destruction and suffering is often obscured by statistics. For example, according to official statistics, 1.3 million people died in Auschwitz. In Mauthausen, a German concentration camp located in Austria, the death toll was only around 100,000 people. Yet the name Mauthausen was whispered with terror by the Auschwitz prisoners. In fact, the conditions at Mauthausen were so brutal that many consider it to be the worst concentration camp ever built by the Germans. The camp was opened in March of 1938 near an Austrian town that was also called Mauthausen. Its most infamous feature was the granite quarry, a massive gaping hole in the earth, notorious for its high death rates and unbelievably harsh conditions. There was a reason why the guards nicknamed it the Bone Grinder. Any Mauthausen prisoners who were healthy enough to work were used as slave labour in the quarry. Stanislaw Lada, a former prisoner, recalls his arrival at the camp. He says, "I asked my Austrian colleague what it actually is, and he replied, a lot of beating, working, and no food." The quarry did have civilian workers who were employed by the German Earth and Stoneworks Company. These civilians worked in supervisory roles and they oversaw the more technical aspects of quarry work. The prisoners dealt with the digging and carrying of the granite blocks, and they were brutally kept in line by the SS Kommandoführers. For the prisoners, the workday at the quarry lasted between 11 and 12 hours in the summer and 9 hours in the winter, regardless of weather conditions. The life expectancy of a prisoner toiling in the quarry was between 6 weeks and 3 months. Then they would probably die from exhaustion or injury. Probably the most ominous landmark of Mauthausen Quarry was the infamous Stairs of Death. It's hard to see from looking at pictures of the stairs just how dangerous they actually were. They're carved from the granite of the quarry itself. They climb up 31 metres high, and they're made up of 186 uneven steps. On one side of the stairs is a sheer drop back into the quarry. The uneven height and irregular shape of the steps made climbing extremely hazardous, especially under heavy loads and when the ground was wet or icy. The prisoners had to climb these stairs in a tight formation, carrying almost unbearably heavy granite blocks on their backs. They were forced to do this as quickly as possible, and once they were at the top, they had to carry the blocks another mile or so before they could drop them and return to the quarry for another load. The pace in the quarry was backbreaking, quite literally in a lot of cases. Any prisoner who tried to carry a smaller, lighter stone to make the climb easier was forced to go back to the quarry, beaten the entire way, and then an appropriately sized rock was placed on his back. One survivor recalls an incident in which a man was caught carrying a stone that the SS deemed to be too light. After a brutal beating, the guards forced him back down the steps, and then they loaded a 60-kilogram granite block onto his back. As the survivor says, he had no chance of bringing it back, and so he died. This form of punishment was extremely common, and each time the result was almost always the same. The SS would load a prisoner with an excessively heavy granite block. He would climb up a few steps, going as far as his strength would allow, and then collapse. The block would then tumble down the stairs, crushing anyone behind it. At the top of these stairs of death, the path ran along the edge of a 50-metre cliff. The SS officers stationed there would push prisoners off just for their own amusements. Out of boredom, they even invented competitions, taking bets on which prisoner would reach the top first. The winning prisoner was often forced to jump to his death. They would even make two prisoners fight, trying to push each other off the cliff. So common were these deaths that they became known as parachute jumps. The mistreatment in the quarry was beyond description. Certain ruthless prisoners were given special privileges. These people were known as the capos, and their job was to oversee the work of the other inmates. The capos would walk among the other prisoners, whipping them with rubber hoses filled with sand and gravel. These beatings were constant. They would be hit across the back, the neck, the heads, an endless barrage designed to sap the spirit and force compliance. One method that the SS guards had for ensuring the prisoners kept working beyond their own endurance was to make an example of one of them. When a new work group arrived at the quarry, if a guard saw that one of the men was struggling, he would ask him if he needed to take a rest. The exhausted prisoner would then say yes, and the guard would tell him to take a seat over there on the rock. As soon as the man sat down, he would be shot. The message to the other prisoners was clear: if you stop, you die. After a day of exhausting labour and relentless abuse, the prisoners would be returned to the camp. A French survivor recalls, "All those who died or were sick and injured in the quarry were brought back to the camp in the evening on a cart like old baggage. Some of them had broken bones protruding through their skin, others had ears torn off or deep, dirty wounds in their flesh, but all had the glazed, unseeing eyes of men who were approaching death." As the crowd of exhausted prisoners returned to the camp, the sick and dying would be separated from those who were still healthy enough to work. The selection process was a grotesque spectacle. Every prisoner tried to appear as healthy and vigorous as possible. Those who were dragged away often pleaded, "Please, I'll be stronger tomorrow." But everybody knew that there was no chance of growing stronger. The prisoners' daily calorie intake was approximately 1,300 calories, barely a third of what was needed for a man doing heavy labour to maintain basic body functions. This severe malnutrition, combined with the constant hard work, violence and disease, caused many to deteriorate rapidly. Hunger became an ever-present torment, reducing prisoners to walking skeletons within weeks. Often the sick, along with those who were too weak to resist, were taken to the shower room. There they were stripped naked, laid full length on the stone floor, and doused with water. In winter the temperatures could reach well below freezing. Hours later, their bodies would be black and stiff. When they tried to remove the bodies, they would be stuck to the floor and their skin would tear off. Daily roll call in the camp was itself a form of torture. When the prisoners returned from the quarry in the evening, even the sick and dying were forced to gather in the apple plats to be counted. The guards would deliberately prolong the roll call to increase the suffering of the prisoners. On one winter night, the roll call lasted 5 hours, with the prisoners standing barefoot in the freezing snow. Even after a successful roll call, prisoners weren't always allowed to rest. Many of the capos would wake prisoners in the early hours of the morning and force them to do strenuous exercises so that they would be completely exhausted the following day. There are countless horrific stories from Mauthausen. The following is just a small selection, and nowhere near scratches the surface of what truly happened there. In February of 1941, 389 Dutch Jews arrived from Buchenwald. The next day, the inmates of Mauthausen were forbidden to leave their barracks. Then 50 of the newly arrived Jewish prisoners were chased from the bathhouse naked and driven towards the electrified fencing, where they were shot by perimeter guards. On the second day after their arrival, the remaining Jewish prisoners were led to the quarry. However, they weren't permitted to use the stairs of death to reach the bottom of the quarry. Instead, the SS forced them to slide down the steep slope next to the stairs. The loose stones and the sharp angle of descent caused many severe injuries and deaths. Those who survived the descent were then given excessively heavy rocks to carry and forced to run up the steps. These rocks were so heavy that it took 2 other prisoners to lift them up onto the men's shoulders. There were many deaths on the stairs as the heavy rocks were dropped and rolled down, crushing those behind them. Their first day in the quarry was so terrible that many of these prisoners chose to jump to their death. In at least one case, a group of around 10 men joined hands and jumped together. In just 3 weeks, almost every one of the 389 Dutch Jews had died. On September the 16th, 1941, 104 Dutch Jews were forced at gunpoint to clean out the latrines. They were denied any tools and they were told to do the work with their bare hands. After some time, the SS grew bored and they selected several individuals from the group. They then ordered them to rub the feces on their skin like soap and to eventually eat it. Anyone who refused was instantly shot. After this and many other similar appalling ordeals, everyone from this group was eventually murdered or driven to take their own lives. In 1944, 47 Dutch, American and English officers and flyers were sent to Mauthausen. They were taken to the quarry. The 186 steps were lined on both sides by SS officers and capos wielding cudgels. On their first journey up the death stairs, they were forced to run carrying 25-kilogram stones on their back. On each successive journey, the SS increased the weight. If a prisoner fell, he was beaten and then shot. These relentless runs carried on until 3 p.m. Each time the weight was increased. Then the final elimination began. Half of the surviving men were driven towards the fence dividing the quarry from the SS quarters. Machine gunners stationed nearby mowed down the prisoners whilst SS photographers documented the events. These photos would later be labelled as prisoners who were shot whilst trying to escape. The following morning, the remaining men were fully aware of what awaited them. They made only a few token runs up the death stairs before walking with resignation towards the waiting machine gunners and photographers. Over time, as the place grew, Mauthausen developed a network of subcamps. 2 of these, Gusen 1 and Gusen 2, were especially notorious for their horrific conditions. More people perished in the Gusen subcamps than in Mauthausen itself. One of the most infamous blocks in Gusen was Block 24B, which was designated as the dysentery block. Its nickname was the Bahnhof, or train station, as for the people sent there, this was their last stop before the crematorium. Prisoners suffering from dysentery and too weak to reach the lavatories were dragged and thrown into Block 24B by the capos. They would be left lying on the ground or just piled up on top of each other, covered in their own excrement and that of others. There they would be left to die. No food or medical care ever reached the Bahnhof. Many sick prisoners did everything they could to hide their illnesses, fearing that they would be dragged off to the Bahnhof and hurled in. As well as the Bahnhof, the Gusen subcamps had other methods to dispatch the sick inmates. Those who were too weak to work were dragged into the washrooms and latrines and left there to die. But the number of people dying in Gusen each day became so high that if some prisoners abandoned in the washrooms were still alive after 2 or 3 days, they would be finished off with a water hose inserted into their mouths or rectums. The pressure of this ice-cold water would tear apart their intestines or lungs. The body could then be removed and another prisoner could be thrown in to take their place. Bathing was another way to ensure that the prisoners would be finished off quickly. This usually happened in winter. Prisoners would be dragged to the bathhouse and drenched with ice-cold water. One survivor remembered, "They began bathing the invalids, who were gathered in separate blocks. They were bathed in November and December, twice a day for an hour and a half to 2 hours. The drains were plugged, and they lay in the water so that only their heads were above the surface. It was all for the sake of cleanliness. After each bath, some remained in the water dead. Others went back to their block where nobody beat them, no one tormented them. They received their food portions, and the next day it was the same. A bath in the morning, a bath in the afternoon. After 3 weeks, they had bathed them all. In spring of 1942, Mauthausen received its own gas chamber. Initially this was used to kill Soviet prisoners of war, but later it was used to exterminate the extremely ill inmates. The location and size of claw marks on the walls of the gas chamber indicate that children were among those killed there. In addition to the gas chamber, special vehicles were constructed. These mobile gas vans had their exhaust fumes redirected into the sealed interior. One German officer complained that this method caused the victims to die painfully by suffocation rather than just dozing off peacefully. When the doors on the vehicle were opened, they would find the bodies twisted into grotesque positions, covered in blood and excrement, with their eyes protruding from their sockets. Over time, many people grew desensitized to the horrors of the camps. One of the survivors describes the following scene from Gusen. A scene from the washroom is etched deeply in my memory. After dinner, I went there to wash my feet. Under one of the faucets, a German is tormenting another man who stands naked under the icy water, screaming as he tries to escape. The first man, also screaming, forces him back, explaining it all to him with a thick stick. On one side of the washroom, a Spaniard is washing his feet and loudly singing an aria. On the other side, a Pole is washing himself and praying out loud. In a box known as the coffin lies a man who is still alive but likely already unconscious. Every so often he gasps for air like a fish. Sitting on the stomach of a dying man is another prisoner calmly eating his dinner bread, cutting it into tiny pieces. I thought perhaps he was a friend there to be with him in his final moments, so I asked, "Is he your friend?" "No," he replied, "but there's such chaos in the barrack that at least here I can eat my dinner in peace." Every Mauthausen survivor has these particular memories, little moments of horror that haunted them long after they left. For Lieutenant Lechen, that memory is the disturbing sound that the bodies made as they were dragged feet first to the crematorium. The heads, with the flesh barely clinging to the bone, would emit a sickening thud thumping against the steps. The bodies would then be flung into the cart, limbs tangled in grotesque positions. Lechen remembers that as the bodies lay there, they would emit strange hissing and burping sounds as the trapped gases escaped. Despite the mounting death toll and the unbearable conditions, work in the quarry continued unabated through the 1940s. The SS showed no concern for the lives lost. They saw prisoners as an expendable resource to be worked to death. There were constantly new arrivals to replace those who had died, ensuring a steady supply of labour to extract the granite from the quarry. The brutal routines remained the same: long hours of grueling labour, minimal food and relentless abuse. As the war progressed and Germany faced increasing setbacks, the SS intensified the work demands, pushing prisoners beyond human limits in a desperate attempt to bolster the faltering war efforts. Deaths in the quarry became so commonplace that eventually civilian employees at the site submitted a request to the camp authorities to try and stop the suicides because they found the sight of gore and brain matter sticking to the rocks too disgusting. In response, the quarry was hosed down and the remains removed. Guards were posted at various points along the cliff edge to try and stop prisoners from jumping. Yet, even with these measures in place, the relentless cruelty within Mauthausen persisted until 1945. The SS guards, anticipating the imminent collapse of the Third Reich, began trying to remove any evidence of their crimes. Mass executions were hastily organised, and the remaining prisoners in the camp were subjected to even harsher treatments. Mauthausen now teetered on the brink of chaos, with disease and starvation claiming countless lives every day. In the final days of the camp, the SS launched a mass extermination campaign. They mainly targeted those prisoners who had been forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoriums. In an effort to eliminate any witnesses to their crimes, the SS executed around 3,000 people during this period. On the 3rd of May 1945, the SS officers abandoned Mauthausen, leaving it in the command of 50 Viennese firefighters. On May the 5th, 1945, an American reconnaissance party discovered the concentration camp. Without any guards to keep watch over them, the prisoners of Mauthausen took matters into their own hands. They disconnected the electric fencing and broke through the camp's perimeter. They then poured into the neighbouring villages and countryside in search of food. They also began chasing down any of the capos who were still in the camp. Many of these people were brutally killed on the spot. For the American soldiers that arrived at the camp, it was the most hideous sight they'd ever seen. At Mauthausen they found around 16,000 people, reduced to skeletons and riddled with disease. An information pamphlet from the 11th Armoured Division reported that the bodies of more than 500 were stacked in the area between the two barracks. It's really the smell that makes a visit to a death camp a stark reality, one American soldier wrote. The smell of the dead and dying, the smell of the starving. Yes, it's the smell, the odour of the death camp that makes it burn in the nostrils and memory. I will always smell Mauthausen. Seeing the extent of the horrors at Mauthausen, the Americans rounded up people from the neighbouring villages, marched them into the camp and forced them to clear away the dead bodies. For the camp survivors, every possible medical measure was provided for them, and they were warned not to eat too much as their bodies couldn't handle such a sudden increase in food. Yet within the next few days, more than 3,000 people died. After years of slow starvation, they just couldn't resist the urge to eat when food became available, and their weakened bodies just shut down. Many others died because they attempted to leave the camp before they were strong enough. They were desperate to leave this hell behind and return to their homelands, so they ignored the Americans' warnings to stay put, and they wandered out into the wilderness and died along the way. 2 years after the liberation of Mauthausen, on the 27th and 28th of May 1947, American soldiers executed 48 of the camp's former operators, officials and doctors. Each of these men died by hanging in the courtyard of Landsberg prison in Bavaria. One man reportedly took 18 minutes to die. Afterwards, the bodies were unceremoniously buried in a trench that was dug outside the prison walls. Despite this, many of those who committed unspeakable atrocities in Mauthausen were never punished. Mauthausen and its subcamps were among the last of the concentration camps liberated by the Allies. Mauthausen today stands as a memorial and educational site, preserving the history of the atrocities committed there and honouring the memories of its countless victims. At the Mauthausen Memorial, many of the original structures remain intact. Visitors can visit the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the shower rooms and the hospital, and they can of course visit the Bone Grinder quarry and walk the infamous Stairs of Death. So thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you found that interesting. One of the hardest things about covering a story like this is deciding which horrific thing to cover over another, because there's just so many things that happen there that you can't cover it all. I hope you found it informative anyway. Big thanks as always to the patrons for supporting the channel. It's much appreciated. Thanks once again for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.